Here we go again, my friends. Another episode of the Leo and Larry Show. Thank you once again for tuning in and finding out the things that you need to know and the places you need to go so that you and our communities can grow. And my co host, Larry Smith, is not with us at this time, but as always, he will be back. He's busy getting out his newspaper, the Community Times, the Upstate Times, the Charleston Chronicle, so that we have another way of knowing what's going on and the things that we need to know. But we have a guest all the way from the Motor City, Detroit, Michigan, an awesome personality, an awesome organizer, activist, and advocate. And I'm talking about none other than Monica Lewis Patrick, who is the president and the CEO of We the People of Detroit. Monica, it's so good to have you on the Leo and Larry show. And we always ask people to start off by telling our guests little things about yourself, how you came to do the work that you do, and tell us about your organization, We the People of Detroit.
Yes, sir. Well, first of all, Reverend Woodbury, let me tell you just what a privilege it is to be with you again and to be on the Leo and Larry show. Always excited about any opportunity that I can sit in your presence, hear about the great work that you're doing and how our work can connect. And so thank you for the invitation. But I have the honor and privilege of serving as the president and CEO of We the People of Detroit. We're a small nonprofit here that was founded by five African American women. I am one of those founders. The other four women are exceptional women and leaders in their own right. But we came together in 2008, really fighting against mayoral control and the taking over of public education and really commodifying it and privatizing it and charterizing it. And so for us, it was an assault on our families. It was an assault on our children's future. And so the five of us worked together for over the course of about 5 weeks, organizing in our communities and with our families to get people to show up. And thank God we were successful in pushing back mayoral control. But little did we know that there were other forms of austerity that were on the horizon that were going to attack our pensions, our homes, and also our access to clean, safe, and affordable water.
Wow, and what is so you formed the organization and I'm just curious. I mean, because so many people see problems in our community. So it was the educational the educational oversight and control that you were trying to make sure it didn't happen on a community level. But what was it about the water issue that made you and your fellow founders and then all the community sports you have turn to the issue of water?
Well, our mentor, the late great honorable Reverend Dr. Joanne Watson, who was a council person here in the city of Detroit, she just passed away on July the 22nd, but she was, I'm sorry, July the 10th, but she was an exceptional leader, and she was one of the folks that was instrumental here in the city of Detroit in working with community and legislators to build the first water affordability policy in the nation, where they were able to take pieces of the United Nations framework that says that families should not pay more, excuse me, than 3% of their income to access drinking water and should not pay more than 4.5% of their income for water, sanitation, and stormwater. And what we found in Detroit is that families are paying anywhere from 10 to 25% of their income. And water rates have gone up over the last 40 years over 258%. And so all of those layers of burdens of debt and of policies that have created austerity, they really have created water apartheid, where Detroiters pay retail for water, but we are legislated by the state of Michigan to sell water to everyone else wholesale. So that on its
Well,
face is an inequitable and unjust decision
mhm.
at the state level.
So you're saying I just want to make sure our listeners hear this because I'm sure that this problem is not, limited to just Detroit or the state of Michigan. So there's a global agreement across the planet that no one should be paying more than 3% of their income for water. Is
Yes, sir.
that's yeah, 3% now. I know a lot of people are paying a lot more than 3%. This may be similar to energy burden. So, and we know burdens are always my one of my mentors, the late state representative Reverend Joe Neal used to say it costs more to be poor. So do you
Mm.
find that for poor people and people of color that they're paying an even higher rate?
Oh, yes, sir. That's one of our concerns is what we've seen is that you've seen divestment from water and drinking water and infrastructure over the last 50 years. I mean, when you look at that up until 1977, we saw about 63 to 68% of the funding that went into drinking water came from the federal government. Now what you're seeing is the federal government is only contributing about 7 to 9% into drinking water. And of course, we've had the historic funding investment in water infrastructure, but we could actually still see a tremendous amount of money going into water infrastructure and still not see policies codified to ensure that every human being has access to that clean, safe, and affordable water. And so what we know in places like Detroit, water rates have gone up over 258% in the last 35, 40 years. We know in Flint, they pay some of the highest water rates in the nation. Their water rates have tripled. They're paying about 320% markup. In Chicago, until last summer, we were seeing in Chicago, water rates had tripled in the last nine years there. Then when you look at Toledo, Toledo's only 45 minutes from Detroit, Toledo, Ohio, we have seen water rates in the last year go up 120% in Toledo, Ohio. And so what we find is as we watch these patterns, not just here in the Great Lakes or the Midwest, but as we look at these patterns of unaffordable water across the nation, we're finding that as more and more water is privatized, we're also seeing that the quality diminishes and the rates increase. So some of
Okay,
the
so
same companies, I'm sorry.
mhm. Now I was gonna say because for programs like this we have people who come in and they may be familiar with some things and other things that completely unfamiliar with them. So when you say water being privatized, can you explain to our audience exactly what you mean? You mean, because I know water comes from heaven for a faith leader like me, from God, right? And
Yes,
water
sir.
is life. No life on this planet can exist without water. It should be a human right. But what do you mean? You mean somebody owns the water?
Yes, sir. What we found is that many of the companies that produce our beverages and juices and soft drinks and pops, those are the same companies that are buying up the aquifers around the globe. They're buying up the main sources of water that comes out of the ground that feeds into your rivers and your lakes and your streams. They're buying up that resource or buying up the land where those resources are so that they can control water. And of course, we know whomever controls the water will actually control the people because you can't live more than 3 days without access to water. And the other thing that we know is that in places like the Great Lakes, you'll have companies like Nestle. For those that have heard of Nestle, a long time company that produces chocolate and other drinks and beverages, they are also one of the major buyers of land that water is accessible in terms of reservoirs and resources to be able to privatize water. We've got a situation here in Michigan where they have the ability just to demonstrate the inequity of some of these companies. Nestle only has to pay $200 a year to be able to almost have unlimited access to pulling out as much water as they would like out of the Great Lakes. But at the same time, if places like Detroit and Flint and Benton Harbor, where water rates have gone up by the utilities, if we don't pay our water bill, and we're seeing in Detroit, water bills on average are $75 to $150. Average water bill in Flint is between $350 to $500.
A
So you're
month?
talking about the equivalent a month. So you're talking about the equivalent of, for some people, what a car payment is, or a house payment, or rent. And so when you put that burden on working class folks that haven't seen their wages increase to that level, then there is no way that they can keep pace with the ever increasing cost of water. It must be subsidized by the federal, the state, and the local governments in order to make sure that everyone can access it. It becomes a public health crisis.
Yes, and I know we have privatized water in South Carolina. In fact, several years ago, I actually sat down with some folks and showed them the legislation, the law that allows companies to buy up water rights. And so that is, I just want folks to know that is not something that is only in Michigan or the states that you mentioned, but we have companies that are buying up access to water all across this country and around the world, correct?
Yes, sir. I mean, case in point, to what you're stating, Rev, is Veolia, the very company that was the main controller of water in France. That company was kicked out of France because of their poor practices around water systems management. Well, wouldn't it be awful to think that we as Americans have now invited that very same company to weigh in on many of the decisions in terms of investments, water quality? What we saw in Flint is Veolia was the very company that had advised Flint that it was all right to drink from a river that if you just looked at it, you knew it was substandard. That same
Wow.
company is also deeply connected to the DeVos family. So the very family that is connected to the privatization of education and the privatization of prisons, many of those are the same folks that have the biggest investment in the privatization of water.
Mhm. Yes, and you mentioned too about how the cost of water, the monthly bills are so high. So what happens when you have people in Detroit, and I don't know if this practice is in other places. You can enlighten both me and the audience. What happens when my water bill gets so high that I can't pay it? What happens? They cut it off, and then I still don't pay it. What happens?
Well, a number of things can happen. First of all, if you're a renter, and we often have to remind people up until the late 1997, Detroit had the highest home ownership per capita in the nation. And so what we saw is we saw predatory lending practices during the economic downturn of 2005 going into 2010. So you had companies that were betting on urban communities all across the nation and small rural communities not able to keep pace with the necessary investments in their overall well-being as communities. So that was one thing. The second thing that we saw happen in Detroit is that Detroit had been the owners of the water system and actually the managers of that system. And one of the tactics that were used, they used a policy called the emergency management law to separate Detroiters from the control of its own asset and to force it into a regional system. And at the same time, they then forced Flint to take on the burden of them building a regional system. And so these were tactics of gentrification, and they were tactics of forcing privatization or at least regionalization so that these Black and Brown communities that had been the epicenters of economic growth and housing ownership and educational upticks for Black, especially Black families, it was a way to dilute their political power so that in these communities, the goal is that there will never be a Democratic stronghold in the communities of Flint, Detroit, and Benton Harbor, where there has been a strong position of African American leadership. And so there's research that was done out of the University of Michigan by a professor by the name of Dr. Sarah Hughes, where she looked at many of the communities that have experienced some form of water crisis are also the same communities that were racially targeted, and they also used the austerity measures of emergency management to dilute our economic power and our political power.
Mhm. Now, I thought there was something in place where in Detroit and in Flint, where they couldn't cut your water off during COVID is another example where maybe you weren't able to pay your water bill. You just didn't have the money, but they couldn't cut your water off. So what's happening now? Can they disconnect your water now?
Well, they could have always turned the water off. What we had to do is 6 months into COVID, we were still fighting for the city and the state to turn water on. So it
Mm,
wasn't just the goodwill of our Democratic governor and our Democratic mayor. It was community fighting and demonstrating that it wasn't good for overall public health. At one point, Detroiters made up 40% of the deaths when we only make up, I'm sorry, not just Detroiters, African Americans make up 14% of the overall population for the state of Michigan. But at the height of COVID, we made up 40% of the deaths. So that
yes.
meant almost one in every two African Americans in the whole state of Michigan ended up dying from COVID. The
Wow.
second
Wow.
thing is that the devastation of that meant that families were disrupted. Some people had wills, others did not. Some property is still in probate. Some property got quick deeded. All kinds of circumstances where people were trying to navigate a global pandemic. We were
Mhm.
successful in convincing with other community partners, the mayor and the water department director for Detroit, to extend it at least another year so that they could keep their promise that they would not return to shutting water off without having legislation in place. Well, we've been working with groups all across the nation for the past 8 years to formulate one, the centering of community needs with the balance of what is it going to take in terms of legislative build out. And one of the beautiful things we were able to demonstrate is that first there has to be a political will to do the right thing for the people. The second
Yes.
thing is that the people have to come to the table with the goals and objectives of being able to be solution focused. And then the next thing we had to do is make sure we were building relationships with legislators and other big green groups, as well as housing groups and women's rights and birthing rights organizations to make sure that we were building the tent wide. And part of that conversation was that we must not return to shutting water off. And then we don't have to because what we know is that if we don't shut water off and we can give families a rate that they can afford, you actually generate more revenue into the water utility that then in turn allows that utility to be able to meet the obligations of maintaining the infrastructure, of creating a rate structure that's affordable, and therefore being able to produce clean, safe, and affordable water. So we see it as a win-win. And what we also know is based on research that was done with Henry Ford Health Systems, which is the largest provider, one of the largest providers in Michigan, along with the Global Health Initiative that actually looks at infectious diseases on a global scale. We were able to take our water shutoff data for the city of Detroit, and the health entity laid over 37,000 cases that came through their ER. And what we found is that if you live on a block and you can afford your water, but only one of your neighbors can't afford their water, it increases the probability of a public health outbreak to that entire neighborhood by 150%. If you
150%.
150%. And then if you can't afford your water, but your neighbor can afford yours, it also increases the outbreak of a waterborne disease about the same percentage numbers. It's about 148%.
Wow.
So even hearing the statistics is not just about you, like you talked about water being there. When we talked about the Bible, water was there in the beginning. It was there before
Mhm.
life.
That's right.
And so
You,
when we recognize the importance of water, there is nothing that can live or exist without this life-sustaining source, and human beings definitely cannot survive more than 3 days without having access to water. And so I've had several utility operators, even in the last couple of days, as we're pleading with our government to center humanity, telling me if you can't pay, you shouldn't get the resource. And what I'm saying to them is if we've gotten to the point where we no longer see human life worthy of accessing water, then no other outside force is going to do more harm to us than we will do to ourselves by denying our own residents access to clean, safe, and affordable water. You cannot be a leader of the
Go
world
ahead.
without
Go
the
ahead.
prioritization of your own residents and cities.
Mm. I just you were rolling so strong. I almost said preach, sister, preach. but but it's absolutely true. But look, what's a water leak, and how what is it that um where children can be taken away from their family if they can't access water?
Well, one of the major things that really traumatized us as Black women at We the People of Detroit, being founded by five Black women, was that early in 2010 and 11, we were hearing horrendous stories from sisters about having their water shut off, about the threat of their children being taken. And so, in the midst of that, we started setting up water stations around the city so that families could just get emergency water while they were trying to navigate the complexity of the relationship that really was adversarial with our own water department because their position was either pay or we're cutting the water off, almost like a mafia kind of approach to it. If you don't have the money, then I may break an arm or a leg kind of feeling. And so,
Mm,
what we found out from social workers and teachers, we brought in the United Nations along with other water advocates. And as part of that conversation was to be able to find out the trauma points in terms of where was water being denied. We wanted to be able to map it so that we could be strategic. We also wanted to hear stories from professionals that were working with children and families that were dealing with water inequity or water disparities. And what we found is that teachers and social workers gave testimony to the United Nations that they were fearful of the impact to families because they knew that it wasn't that families didn't care about their children and weren't being good providers. They couldn't keep up with the ever increasing cost of water. And so, as water was being shut off in mass across the city, up from 2014 up until the pandemic, we saw over 171,000 households shut off from water. And in each
mm,
household, there's anywhere from 3 to 10 people reside. Now, the city says on average about 2.7, but the census doesn't bear them out on that. So when we were
mm,
able to demonstrate that, that was one of the other things that we were able to show was a concern. And thank God for some of our congressional leadership, like Debbie Dingell and the Honorable Rashida Tlaib. They were able to use the citizen science that we had been a part of developing to demonstrate to the CDC that it was not in the best interest of the nation to continue to shut off water. So this is why we were able to see a lot of activity during COVID around creating the LIWAP program, the Low Income Water Assistance Program, because that was the emergency relief to be able to get water restored.
mm. But water liens, actually there are ways, there have been instances where people have lost their property because they couldn't pay their water bill.
Yes, sir. One of the biggest reasons that we saw policies moving in Illinois and specifically in Chicago around the ending of water shutoffs was because it was creating a massive exodus in terms of Black and Brown folks out of home ownership, especially low income home owners. Well, the same thing was happening in Detroit up until 2015. And one of the things we were able to demonstrate with our research is that in 2015 alone, you had 14,000 homeowners lose their homes in Detroit, not because they owed property taxes, but just because they were on a fixed income or a senior citizen or a pensioner, and they could not afford the ever increasing cost of water. Well, once a water lien is transferred from the city or the municipality to the county, it gets commingled and therefore it's not separated as from property taxes to water debt. they mix it all together. And so what we were finding is that many of our folks were losing their homes because of the convolutedness of the policy, but also because there was no one advocating on behalf of the residents to ensure that they were protected. Because according to Michigan law, you're not supposed to lose your home because of water debt. But if that intentionality isn't there, we have seen all across the state, but specifically in Detroit, Black folks losing their property because of the inability to afford the ever increasing cost of water.
And during these auctions, when people were buying up property that, as you said, that since they were commingled, you would think, oh, this is property where people didn't pay their taxes. Not that because of economic factors, people couldn't pay their water bill. So did you see a lot of what we call gentrification, where poor people and people of color were being pushed out of communities, and then that property being developed into residences or homes that people could no longer afford?
Oh, yes, sir. You hit the nail on the head, Rev. It is definitely gentrification and the weaponizing of water as a tool of gentrification. When you look at right now, our water department is offering a program called the Detroit Lifeline, but they've already told us that it's only going to service about 20,000 households. And we know that there's at least 60,000 households right now that are in need of the relief. The other thing that we know we're paying deep attention to is that they're also targeting what they consider middle to high income neighborhoods. Well, what folks may not understand about Detroit is because you've had households in the control of Black families, some of them for 3, 4, 5 generations or more. Some people have been able to hold on to those homes, but in no way does that mean that that individual is wealthy. And so we believe that this is another purging of those neighborhoods to ensure that low to middle income Black folks move out of particular neighborhoods that they want to redesign for wider, younger, wealthier population. And we believe that this is the agenda that's afoot. That's why it's also deeply concerning that right now the mayor of the city of Detroit is working in concert with the suburban interests and those that have an interest other than protecting the residents of Detroit. So we have to speak
Mm,
out and call these things out when we see them.
right. And I tell you, I've traveled across this country, I think 20, somewhere around 29 states that I've been in. And that's what we're seeing across the country. We're seeing, whether you call it revitalization or whatever, we're seeing people being pushed out of communities, and then the development that takes place are apartments, townhouses, condos, homes that the people cannot afford to live in, and people being pushed out. So people actually were losing their property because they couldn't pay their water bill. Correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. And
Yes, sir.
so so just for clarification, so how has that been addressed, and is that a past practice or is that still going on?
No, it's still going on. As a matter of fact, just this past week, the water department activated a new shut off targeting strategy where they are going to target middle to high income neighborhoods. And like I said, some of those neighbors or persons that reside in those neighborhoods may or may not be middle to high income. And then also, there's an assumption that even those folks don't have financial challenges, which we know they can. And so the
Mm,
water department has been very slowful in putting forth the ideas that community has moved forward with around making sure that there were the proper protections, making sure that we weren't shutting water off, but we had pathways for people to be able to pay a bill that they could afford. And so we have been working not only at the local level with our legislators, and very grateful for the president of the city council, along with several members of the council who have agreed to support our actions to develop an ordinance that would protect the residents from shutoffs. And it would also open up the opportunity to renegotiate the lease agreement because Detroiters really should be getting about 218 million from our lease agreement with the region. We're only getting about 33 million. And
Mhm.
so that on its face is creating another layer of inequity and injustice. But the other part that we think we have an opportunity with is that with having the trifecta at the state level with a democratically leaning governor and legislative body, and also our Michigan judiciary system, right now is a great time for us to introduce legislation that would codify at the state level water affordability. So we're
Mhm.
working through the concept of the WELL Coalition, which means Water Equals Life Coalition. And we have a number of organizations, some of which are the National Wildlife Federation and also Freshwater Future, Mothering Justice, Progress Michigan. A number of groups are working with us so that we can make sure that we take advantage of this opportunity. It does no good for us to push to elect people that supposedly represent our interests and then not be able to get the policies we need to protect our interests.
Mm. Say amen. Now you mentioned citizen science, and that is a powerful tool because you said it was the citizen science that allowed people to be able to testify uh, to the United Nations. And here in South Carolina, there's an example of citizen science helping a community in North Charleston. They were expanding the port of Charleston. And so some folks got together with stationary and portable air monitors, etc. And they were able to show the citizens, the people of communities, that there were going to be an impact on air quality, etc. And they working together with the county and the city were able to access $8 million. Some went
Yes.
to the county, some went to the city, but some went to the local country alliance for model communities, where they're currently working on putting grocery stores in place. They've set up college scholarships. They have minority business loans that they can give out, and so a lot of people we're just dependent on agencies and other folks to come in, but citizen science is real, and maybe you can give us some examples of what you did in Detroit utilizing citizen science to make changes and make a difference.
Yes, sir. And thank you for lifting citizen science. We were deeply inspired by your work and the work that was happening there in South Carolina, as well as work we saw across the country. And we knew that from the conversations we were having with government and also with, be it local, state, and the EPA, as well as the conversations we were just having amongst our own community members, that we had to get more educated in terms of the science of water. We also had to be clear about who controlled what particular jurisdiction of the water system, and then also being able to map and visualize so that our community, regardless of the varying degrees of literacy and comprehension, that everyone else could see the same thing so we could move together. And so we created a book called Mapping the Water Crisis, the dismantlement of African American neighborhoods in Detroit. That small book became a critical pamphlet and instruction guide in terms of the conversations we started to have with government, and we also started to have with institutions of higher learning. And so by using that as a tool, one that demonstrated community intelligence, it also demonstrated that we weren't sitting on our hands waiting on anybody to rescue us, that we were working and using all of our God-given abilities. And as one of our elders reminded us, many of us had been to the academy as well. So we had degrees in varying subject matters, and we were able to bring that all together. And so now we have a table of about 67 researchers from all across the country, from various institutions that work with We the People of Detroit, but we hold all of the information at We the People of Detroit in proxy for our community. So some of that information was used during the Flint water crisis. It was part of legislation and litigation. As I said earlier, it was used by Congresswoman Dingell and Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib They used it to be able to appeal to the CDC. It's being used by the EPA as a standard for how community must be engaged in conversations around water affordability, water access. And we are right now working with Stanford University to do a water quality testing project that will span over 3 years. And we're also in the process of developing our own legal arm of our organization because we find that because of these water injustices, they're happening to Black and Brown people more frequently. We need to have Black and Brown litigators prepared already on deck, understanding the science of the issue, but also how to litigate on behalf of community to promote equity and justice.
And that is, I'd say that's something that needs to be replicated and shared. And a lot of folks don't realize with citizen science also, these are things that need to be put in place before plants are built, before certain things take place, so that we can measure what happens, rather than be reactive. We can be proactive by utilizing that. And we'll have a conversation offline about that because we're actually working on a project with Columbia University and Rutgers University, where we're going to be looking at some water quality issues and flooding in some rural communities. And so I'm just so were there specific tools that you used? Were you like using measuring devices, water gauges, doing surveying. Exactly how did the citizen science? Can you be a little more granular in talking about it, giving some
Sure.
examples? Mm.
Well, we did a couple of methods. One is that we used the Casper, which the Casper is the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. It's a method that they use when there is a natural disaster and they have to go in and assess things from a public health standpoint very quickly. We adapted that along with Dr. Nadia Gaber, who is a medical anthropologist and she's also an MD. So she was able to help us come up with an instrument that would help us assess a man-made disaster. And so
Oh,
with that analysis, we could not get any publication in the U.S. And finally, we were able to get the Oxford School of Public Health to publish our data. And what they told us is that, according to their research, it's the only research of its kind in the world. And what we were
mm,
able to demonstrate is we were able to demonstrate the third world conditions in the U.S. And the fact that there is a psychosocial impact to the thinking and the psychological processing of a person when they fear not having enough water. And so we were able to demonstrate that. We also were able to do some work, like I said, around our own mapping of water shutoffs with the Henry Ford Health Systems and the Global Health Initiative. Well, that was cutting edge research because it showed in real time some of the waterborne diseases that people were contracting. And by layering over the water shutoff data, it actually demonstrated that there is correlation between shutting off water and the waterborne illnesses that we were seeing in an uptick in the city. That was another place where it caused the city to pause in shutting water off because we were able to show the public health correlation. We also have done, just with our youth, one of the most powerful projects we did was in 2018. We saw over 100 schools. The water was shut off at the water fountains and in the bathrooms where they wash their hands because of uptick in lead and lead pipes. And so, because of that, what our children did is they came to us and said, we want to test the water in our schools. We believe that they've been poisoning us and not telling us. Well, they
mm,
hadn't. They had known this information since 2016. The mayor didn't release it until 2018 because he was running for reelection. And so, with that information, we worked with our children and got them trained in the testing of water. And then we hired a lab so that we could make sure that we controlled the transference of that information and also receiving the analysis back. What the youth were able to do is that over the course of about 4 weeks, they were able to test enough households and to bring enough attention to the issue that the governor, Governor Whitmer, actually established a task force to be able to address the lead in school issue. So
Wow.
many of these babies, it was 16 of them. None of them were of voting age. All of them were in high school. They were some of the best and brightest students in the city of Detroit. But because they used their voice and their agency to go to water board meetings, to go to meetings with the mayor, to put pressure on the school board, that attention then brought about a change and a shift in how we deal with schools and lead toxicity in the entire state. So,
Wow.
those have been some of the moments that I think have been most impactful is when the community is able to wrap their minds around the information. And then through the power of information, they use their own agency to lift their own voice.
Yeah, so people don't have to, and that's what we find in communities across the country and around the world, where people feel hopeless, they feel
Yes.
helpless, and they feel that they just have to endure whatever happens. But those are great examples of how people, no matter how young, can come together and actually make a change on a state level, on a national level, and even a global level. Those are all amazing things. And another thing I want to ask you about, then, because you're much more knowledgeable about these things than I am, I found
No, I don't
out
know about
recent.
that, Doc.
No, I
I
know
don't
you.
know
When
about
it comes to water, now we all have, different gifts of the body. The finger doesn't
that.
do what the mouth does, right? So,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
so there's a lead and copper pipe inventory, a federally mandated, I understand, lead and copper pipe inventory that every water system has to do across this country for their service lines. Yeah,
Yes,
are you
sir.
familiar? Yeah. And so that's supposed to be completed, I understand, next year. Is that right?
Well, that's the expectation is that they would at least be able to wrap their arms around where the lead pipes are. But we
Mhm.
know in some of the older cities, that's still going to be a challenge, that there's, excuse me, still going to be shooting in the dark. Like, for example, we know in Detroit, there's a projection that we have 80,000 lead lines. That's just a projection. Because what
Right.
we found is that as you go into some of these older homes, there's been, different points of actually transitioning out certain materials for other materials. So you may have, uh, you know, some form of plastic, at least in the home utility infrastructure. And then as you get closer to the line, that's when you can find out, oh, wow, this is the lead line that's feeding into the main home system. And so that's why one of the things we were able to work with our youth on is as they did water testing, we were able to teach them how to teach the residents how to identify if they had a lead line coming into the home. So being
Right.
able to just take a coin and scraping the metal will let you see sometimes what kind of metal it is to be able to determine whether that's a lead line. We also did some GIS mapping where we were able to take certain addresses and by taking photos and testing the water, and then also having another expert come in behind us to assess whether it was a lead line or not. Some of that mapping also caused more people to get involved in the process because I don't think many times people even think about where their water comes from. And unless
Mhm.
they taste something wrong with it or they smell something's wrong with it, they just assume that more than likely it's clean.
Mhm. Yeah,
And so
and
with that, yes, sir.
I was going to say we're going to have an offline discussion about that because that means the water system where the water systems where all of our listeners are drinking from. This is something we all need to be aware of because we know what happened in Flint and so many other different places when we deal with water quality. But here's my concern. My concern is this. Okay, so the Inflation Reduction Act and changing our infrastructure nationally so we get rid of lead and copper service lines. But what about the homes that were built before 1988? that have lead pipes, under them because they're going to replace the service line, but who's going to replace the lead pipes that are under our homes?
Well, and I think that that's what we learned from Flint is that it's not good enough just to replace the service line, that we have to do a total replacement. So that means not just from the line to the curb, that means from the line to the curb to the entire to the tap. So
Mhm.
the full system has to be replaced because what we know, just like you said, Rev, in some of these older homes, we know that they have galvanized iron, they have copper, they have lead. Some have a combination of all of those things. And so it has to be about a prioritization. And one of the things we talk about often with legislators is that our expectation is not that they would perform magic or they would be able to fix all of this overnight, but if we can strategically put together the gathering of information, a national database, the ability to be able to create mapping and at least a national data system that would allow us to do a worst first kind of calculation where we prioritize those communities across the nation that have the worst conditions and we begin to solve and check off those conditions and work ourselves across the country because we realize there's only X amount of dollars. But if we're able to treat worse first and get homes stabilized so that low income families are stabilized, then what we should see is less money needing to be spent in other areas if those people are able to afford their water and that water is clean and that water is safe, then they should be able to get to work and they should be able to keep the water on and they shouldn't lose their children. All of these things that become a threat or a burden.
Right. And see, we were thinking so much alike because that's exactly where I was going to go, that we need to look at the worst case scenarios and address them first. And the same thing happens with, because oftentimes the communities with the most money have the most influence, and they're the ones who get the benefits first. And same thing. I was speaking with someone about air quality issues. That we know that the communities with the worst air quality tend to be poor communities, people of color communities. But when we look at, say, for example, replacing school buses and with electric buses, um, oftentimes you don't see governing bodies saying, "Hey, let's look at air quality. Let's look at the worst case scenarios that need to be addressed first." But rather, it's more about influence, affluence, and those who have political clout and their communities being serviced first. So I like some of the tools that you're talking about, and the citizen science piece that might be able to help communities be dealt with more equitably and attain more justice when it comes with results. So tell what are you looking at next? You talked about a whole bunch of stuff, and
Yes, sir.
your platter is full. But I know there's also some other things that you and we the people of Detroit are looking at. Can you enlighten us about some of those things?
Yes, sir. We're looking at a couple of things. We are in the process of over the last 4.5, 5 years, we've been working with other BIPOC, specifically Black youth organizations, around getting more youth trained in what we call the 7 buckets of water, looking at the science of water, looking at the fact that water has a spirit and that there is every religion has some form of water ceremony. We also found that it was very important that we begin to invest in younger people creating narrative and messaging and using art and culture to have conversations about water, around water disparities, but also innovation and creativity and workforce development ideas. We also look at water policy, the sociology of water. Many times people don't understand housing patterns and why people live where they do, and some of the things that we don't always factor into our strategies they actually come up when you start looking at all the facets that in different ways that water touches our lives. And so we recognize through working with youth that many of our children in places that were often traumatized by water disparities or crisis, our children weren't talking about trauma, but they were talking about transformation. And so as
Mm,
we began to follow their leadership, that they were not stuck in trauma, even though they had been poisoned in Flint and water shut off in Detroit and algae blooms in Toledo, all of this kind of disparity, they still were able to look for ways where, what can we do about it? How can we solve it? How can we make it better? And so, with their ingenuity and creativity, it really allowed us to create and set a table so that now we are bringing other youth together. So, we just finished doing a 1 week retreat in historic Idlewild, Michigan, which is still one of the few Black resort towns. It's still active in the nation. It actually has one of the cleanest lakes in Michigan in this predominantly Black owned small rural community. And so we've considered a blessing to be able to go there, take our children there. It's a way for them to commune with nature in a very safe kind of environment. It's land that has been under the control of Black leadership for over 100 years. It's also a way for us to continue to invest in the vitality of Idlewild and also exposing our children to some of the other water issues like invasive species and erosion and things like that that they often don't hear about in the urban core. And so with
mm.
that, we're excited about that growth. We're also investing. As a matter of fact, when I get off this call, I'll be getting on a national call with 5 of our partners because we're establishing a legal arm of We the People of Detroit. I just got back from Jackson, Mississippi. And as we're being
Wow.
called to conversations across the nation, what we're finding is that our communities are responding because many times we are in crisis. And what we're finding out is that as we go through crisis, we actually come up with solutions. We come up
Mhm.
with strategies, the citizen science methodologies that we've established. We're actually building a toolkit because we want other communities to be able to replicate the things that we've learned from. And so that's some of the work we've committed to now. We're creating a legal arm. We've got some partnerships with 5 universities that are going to give us legal students that will be working with us at a local, state, national, and international level on water. So we hope to roll that out next year. We've also bought a tremendous amount of property because we've got to be investing in our own survival and investing in our community survival. So we've
Mhm.
purchased property to be able to keep rent low. What we've seen in Detroit is that rent has actually tripled in certain parts of the city. And that's going to make it extremely difficult for low income and working families, and especially knowing that about 60% of the households in the city of Detroit are headed up by single women of color. And so that on its face is going to make it very difficult for those women to maintain a household, to maintain an income, and to keep their children in a safe environment that's educating them if they're not able to just maintain water. And so that's some of what we're focused on right now is ways to be able to intersect the housing concerns, the water, the education, with ways to build collective power, to make sure that we're organizing. And one of the things we learned from the Honorable Coleman Alexander Young, he said, if you find a good fight, get in it. We are in the fight for the human right to water, and we're not just in it, we're going to stay in it till we win.
Absolutely. And we have a few minutes left, but one of the things before we end, I want our audience to be aware of the fact that a lot of the problems and concerns, um, almost all of them that you mentioned, exist in every community and in totality or in part. And I know that a lot of the issues that you've lifted up also exist in South Carolina. And we've had people in Denmark, South Carolina, et cetera, who have not been able to drink their water. We have people all across the state who have concerns about clean drinking water that is safe and looking at ways that we can ensure that we can correct some of the problems and deficiencies that we have in our water delivery system. And so I just want you to, because we have a few minutes left, say a little bit about that, about how these concerns and these problems are not limited just to Detroit, Michigan, and some of the other Midwestern states and cities that you mentioned. So just letting people know that we have water issues everywhere, right?
Oh, yes, sir. Thank you for raising that question, Reverend Woodbury. Yes, this is a national crisis. And what we know is that there are parts of the country where people are not experiencing water disparity, that they feel like they have a lot of access to water. But if we look at climate impacts and we look at even just what we've seen in the past couple of years in terms of the Colorado River, in terms of seeing what happened in California with the fires, well, what we know is a lot of that is actually driven by the fact that there is water being extracted from critical parts of the infrastructure and the ecosystem that allows the natural hydration of the earth. So when you pull out water because you're just going to put it in a plastic bottle and sell it, but you're not paying attention to how much you're pulling out and the fact that it's throwing off the ecosystem, these things are creating the wildfires. These things are creating the contamination. We also have mining and excavation. We have fracking. All of these things create an imbalance within our water systems. And what we know is that the critical point we're at right now is that research was done in 2017 by Dr. Elizabeth Mack at Michigan State University. And she didn't do it based on Michigan. She did a national assessment. And what she found is that by the year 2024, her projections are that 35.6% of the nation, almost 36% of all Americans, will not be able to afford their water because of privatization and also because of water disparity. We're seeing droughts, we're seeing floods. So you're seeing these extremes, and these extremes are also creating a stress on your water infrastructure system, on the pipes, on the pumping stations, on all of the things that presses water into your household. And then on top of that, the fact that we have not invested over the last 50 years the way we should have in maintaining that infrastructure. Because many of our pipes, if you look at Detroit, Detroit's water system is over 130 years old. But when
Mhm.
you look at the pipes in certain parts of the city, we have logs that are transporting water throughout the city. Not iron, not metal, wooden logs that
Wood.
were hollowed out almost 150 years ago as part of building this initial infrastructure. So we don't know what's going through those particular wooden pipes, but to think they've been there that long, you know there's got to be some kind of buildup and potential pathogens that are resting in those parts of the pipes.
Mhm.
And the other thing that we know too is that based on work that we've done with Policy Link, they actually have a caucus called the Water Energy Climate Caucus. And in that caucus, some of the things that we hear is not just in places like the urban core, but as I talk to rural communities, many of them are being forced into consolidation or regionalization because they don't have the tax base to do the necessary upgrades to their infrastructure. And so this is not just an urban issue, this is an urban, suburban, and rural issue. When you look at Michigan as a state, across the state, water rates have gone up for everybody 188%. It's
Mhm.
more in the urban areas, the older urban areas, that you see it double and triple those numbers. But just for everybody. So we know that all families are really having a hard time in keeping pace with all of the ever increasing costs that we've seen. We all are under this burden of inflation right now. But when you can't maintain the basics like water, and you're seeing your water rates double and triple, then we know that we're already at a state of crises. And one of the things I often talk about is national security. We don't have to fear the imposition or another outside threat or enemy outside of our domestic territory. We will destroy ourselves from the inside because we will not be able to maintain good public health and hygiene without the ever necessary access to clean, safe water. And we say it, and I'll continue to say it again, water is a human right. We must have the courage in this country to codify it as so.
Amen. Thank you so much, Monica Lewis Patrick. And I'm sure that a lot of people have been educated and enlightened. And you say the same thing I always say in terms of security. Go online, look at what the Pentagon said. And we're talking about not recently, about 20 years ago. Water shortage will become the greatest catalyst for war on this planet. Water shortage is real and it's happening now. But thank you so much for everything. We're running out of time, but you and I are going to talk offline if you don't mind. For a little bit, and I just want to say to the audience, I hope that you've gained a lot of knowledge. I hope that you come together to protect yourself, your families, and the future because water is life. You can't live without it, and it is a human right. So, Monica, why don't you tell folks how they can contact you and also we, the people of Detroit?
Thank you so much, Reverend Woodbury. And I just appreciate being on with you and your listening audience. You can reach us at We the People of Detroit, We the People of Detroit.com. We're on Facebook, we're on Twitter, we're on Instagram, we're on LinkedIn. And then also for those that want to join our Water Equals Life Coalition, please go to WEL Coalition.org, the Well Coalition, WEL Coalition.org, and you can take the pledge to support the water affordability plan. And then you can also keep updates in terms of what is moving in Michigan to change access to clean, safe, and affordable water. But I appreciate you so much, Rev. As always, I learned something and I get to share something.
Thank you. We, excuse me, we appreciate you as well. And as always, if you want to reach out to me, you can reach us at info@newalphacdc.com. Visit our website, www.newalphacdc.com. And also, you can call us at the church that I am privileged and honored to pastor, Kingdom Living Temple, by calling 843-799-0740. So thank you once again, Monica Lewis Patrick, for all the great work that you're doing. And remember how we always close this out. If you want to learn the things that you need to know and go to the places where you need to go, tune in to the Leo and Larry Show. Until next week, God bless you and keep you.